Stepney was cold and alone, along with his crew. He had been on loan for a whole week and was finally returning to his home. He was told he could make it there through the night, which he saw no problem in. He had had several nighttime runs, and in some ways preferred them to the daytime ones. They were more peaceful, and he enjoyed travelling under the moonlight. On this night, however, no one mentioned the fog. It was very thick too, and Stepney's lamp didn't make much of a difference. He had no idea how far he was from home, but more importantly, he didn't know where he was right now. He had hoped he would, as he was sure he was taking the same route he had used to where he was loaned. Surely this must be the same one. As he continued on, he noticed something in the distance, a bright red glow. Stepney knew what it was.
Hey, look, it's a signal.
He called to his crew.
Ah, maybe we can ask the signalman where we are.
The driver put on the brakes, and the little engine came to a gentle stop, next to the signal. Once they were close enough, they could also make out the signal box. The signalman spotted them too, and walked towards the door.
Looks like the signalman wants to see us.
Rather him than us. Your fire's so warm, I don't want to leave it.
Driver, I don't think we took this route before.
Really? Why's that?
Because I don't remember seeing that.
The driver and fireman looked at what Stepney was referring to. There was a set of buildings that looked as if they hadn't been touched for decades. They could also see several sidings that had rusty, overgrown track, and among all of this was a lonely single-row shed that, much like the other buildings, had seen better days. Stepney wasn't sure if he was scared or intrigued. What is this place? He turned back to the signalman that had just stopped in front of them.
Evening, you lot. Haven't exactly picked the best night for a run, have you?
No one told us about the fog. I thought it would be a clear night.
Well, that's the weather for you. The bastards will say you're going to get a lovely day, but it ends up being miserable. Anyway, where are you heading?
Brighton.
Brighton? Then why are you taking this route? It's the longest one there.
Well, that's the thing. We don't really recognise this route. We didn't take it before. How far is Brighton from here?
Honestly, I don't know the exact distance. Regardless, I don't recommend reaching it tonight, lads. This fog's getting worse by every minute, and it isn't safe.
Stepney groaned. This was the last thing he wanted to hear.
But where can we stay? I don't want to stay out here. It's dark and miserable.
Well, you can stay in that shed over there by the mines. It's not pretty, but it'll have to do.
Oh, so that's what that place is.
No idea how long it's been there. I took control of this box 8 years ago.
The signalman paused. He looked at all the buildings from one to another. He seemed to be deep in thought.
I've heard stories about this place, when it was being operated and some of its incidents.
What kind of stories?
Well, let's just say some of them are rather unpleasant. I always hear noises from there too, as if there's still people in the mines. But I know that's impossible. All the mines have collapsed. No one can fit in there now. Could have just been in my head.
He then turned to the crew in the cab.
As for you two, you're welcome to stay in the box as long as you don't create any distractions.
Of course. Thank you.
Stepney slowly backed down into the shed. The wooden walls were all rotten and dirty, and there were holes in the roof. However, he realized it was either the shed or staying on a siding in the cold temperature and mist. But that wasn't the only thing on Stepney's mind.
What do you think that signalman was talking about?
The crew had put out his fire, and they walked round to the front of him.
Not sure. If you ask me, he sounds a bit crazy. Can't say I'm surprised when he spends almost every day in that little box.
Oi! Enough of that! That signalman you call crazy was kind enough to give us a shelter for the night. Unless, of course, you want to sleep outside.
Oh, God, no! Can't stand another second out here. Sorry, Stepney. Wish you had better shelter than this.
Yes, well, I guess it'll have to do. I'll be fine. East Grinstead's been worse than this, long ago.
Make sure you get loads of rest, old boy. We've still got a way to go tomorrow.
I'll try. Oh, good night, you two.
Good night, Stepney.
Good night, Stepney.
And with that, the driver and fireman walked away towards the signal box. And now, Stepney was truly alone. He couldn't see very far in front of him. The mist made it feel like he was on a very small pocket of land, completely separated from the rest of the world. And there was no one. No one besides him. Stepney wasn't sure if he would ever get sleep, but gradually he felt more and more tired. Finally, he closed his eyes and sleep took over.
Hello? Is anyone there?
Stepney didn't know how long he was asleep. When he opened his eyes, everything was the same. He was still at the old mine, still in the old dirty shed. What was different was the mist. It was even thicker now, and the area around him felt even smaller. Of course, though, that wasn't what woke him. Stepney surveyed all the deserted buildings, but he couldn't see anyone. But if there's no one, who did he hear?
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
The voice had an echo to it, as if it was coming from a cave. That could only mean one thing. Stepney looked towards the mine entrances that he could just make out through the blanket of fog.
Wait, someone is in there. Help! Someone please help!
Stepney began to feel uneasy. That wasn't the same voice as before. Was there two people in there?
Is anyone there? I'm trapped.
Another one. How many were in there? Snapping out of his confusion, Stepney realized that the logical thing to do was to call back. So whoever was in there would know they would have been heard and would be freed. Stepney could only imagine how terrible it would be to be trapped inside a mine with no way out and no light to help them see. He would feel like a monster if he just stood by and did nothing. He opened his mouth to speak, but then he closed it. Stepney realized he had forgotten something. Something that the signalman had said.
All the mines have collapsed. No one can fit in there now.
Stepney wasn't just confused, but now he was scared. Was the signalman telling the truth? Did he mean every single mine shaft? If he did, no one should be in there. No one could be in there.
Hello?
At that point, more cries can be heard. Several voices now, all of them expressing nothing but complete fear and horror, and all Stepney could do was sit motionless and listen. He then made a decision. Whether it was impossible for them to be in there or not, he knew better than to ignore them. He opened his mouth to try and call out again. However, he was interrupted again, but not because of his thoughts. The voices were now not the only sounds he could hear. Now, he could make out the sounds of rocks crumbling within the mines, as if there was a large, deadly stampede. The calls for help were now replaced with crying and screaming, Any chances of saving whoever was in there had faded away. Stepney felt like crying. His fire was out, he couldn't see the signal box his crew was in, and the sounds of screaming showed no signs of ending. Then, without warning, there was silence. There was no more screaming, no more rocks crumbling, just silence. Stepney couldn't pull himself out of the shock he was in. Despite all he heard, it didn't add up. If the mines were buried, as the signalman said, then no one could be in there. But someone was in there. The thought of sleep never crossed Stepney's mind. He had just witnessed something terrifying. Something that shouldn't be possible. How could he sleep after that? As the night wore on low, he felt more and more exhausted, and once again he closed his eyes and drifted into slumber. When Stepney opened his eyes, it was daytime and the fog had lifted. He looked in front of him and saw his driver, fireman, and the signalman walking towards him.
Morning, Stepney. How was your night?
Oh, am I glad to see you.
The crew were confused. They then looked closely at their engine and realized he was very pale.
Stepney? What's the matter? Are you okay?
I heard something last night. There were noises. Noises coming from the mine.
What? Are you serious?
I wish I wasn't.
Were they the sounds of people crying for help?
All eyes immediately fixated on the signalman, and Stepney began to shiver.
Yes. How did...
Wait, what are you talking about? You know something about this too.
I've heard stories like that in the mines before. Already told you that last night.
But you said they were in your head.
I said they could have just been in my head, but after what Stepney just said, I wish they were.
There was a long silence. No one knew what to say. At last, the silence was broken by Stepney.
You said you heard stories about this mine. Stories that were unpleasant. What are they? Do they have something to do with what I heard last night?
The signalman didn't respond for a moment, but then slowly nodded his head.
From what I've been told, these mines were operated in the early 20th century. It only lasted 7 years. The reason why? It was known as one of the most dangerous places in Britain.
Well, industries like this were usually dangerous back then, I should know.
As an engine from the 19th century, Stepney had witnessed the growth and change of railways and industry throughout the last several decades. Not just in technology, but also the importance of safety. Nowadays, safety is regarded as a top priority, unlike back then.
Yeah, but anyone who's worked there got the worst of it. The equipment was rarely well maintained and most of it was out of date. That sort of thing led to accidents. Well, I say accidents, but if the people in charge did their job and make sure the place was in proper working condition, it would have lasted longer. It was believed that the managers didn't give a damn about their workers. They were all expendable in their eyes. So, I always saw those accidents as murders.
Stepney and his crew went pale after hearing that.
Those who were in the mine, however, suffered the most. The wooden shafts holding them up were weak and rotten. No one had ever considered replacing them. That resulted in several collapses that occurred over those 7 years, leaving many miners trapped. At least when it came to those with the equipment, their deaths were most quick and painless. But those in the mines, their pain was almost endless. They had no light, no food, and sometimes no air. They can do nothing except for cry for help, hoping it will come. It rarely did. The voices you heard last night, Stepney, were those men who were sadly unlucky.
Stepney was horrified. He now wished he didn't ask for this, but it was too late now.
I knew one of those lucky few. He was only at the mine for a year, but one time being trapped was too much. Once he was freed, he resigned and exposed the careless management. That was in 1909, the same year the mine closed. As for this person, let's just say if this man didn't survive, I wouldn't be here right now.
What are you talking about?
That man was my father. He got a new job as a shopkeeper, and I was born 2 years after he left the mine. He told me all this when I was a teenager, and well, my reaction was the same as yours. When I became the signalman and was assigned to this box, at first I was scared, but when I think about it, it felt right for me to be here, to keep those lonely miners some company. As the son of one of their colleagues, even though I can't help them, and I have to listen to them suffer almost every single night.
The signalman sighed and looked back at the crew and Stepney.
I called ahead, and there aren't any trains scheduled to come down this route, so you have a clear path. Sorry I scared you.
It's fine.
Stepney said quietly. In truth, he wasn't scared anymore, but felt sad. The crew entered the cab, and the little engine puffed away. It was early in the afternoon when Stepney finally returned to Brighton. Several engines passed him, whistling hello. He whistled back, but his peeps were short and quiet. The shed was mostly empty, save for a few engines. Without saying a word, Stepney went to the very back of the shed. He saw no point in telling them about what had happened. He was sure they wouldn't believe it and laugh at him. That was the last thing he needed. He closed his eyes, and this time, nothing horrifying disturbed him. Stepney never went past the old mine again. He never had the chance, as a year later he was withdrawn from service and taken to a scrapyard. He wasn't there for long though, as he was restored and purchased by the Bluebell Railway, where, aside from a few visits to other railways, he has remained ever since. He did eventually learn that the route he had taken on that night was ripped up due to the lack of any important traffic. However, he never learned of what became of the signalman. Naturally, he lost his job there, but what about afterwards? Did he get a new job? Perhaps he was assigned to another box. He didn't know, and he never would. As time went on, Stepney thought less about the old mine. What he encountered there didn't seem to matter anymore. The line that went past it was now gone, and it was a place that the world would soon forget. Sometimes though, when he's asleep, Stepney is sure he can hear voices. Voices of the miners, calling and crying for help that they will never get.